this workshop to order. Be fancy with it. I've asked our staff here what sort of guardrails they want on the conversation and been told you can ask questions whenever you want, so just let me know. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joanna.
Madam Chair, thank you. We are here today to do our annual update on the Ramsey County Transit portfolio. This is both a business status and a financial update. And I will turn it over to Brian, and we'll just dive right in.
Thank you, Joanna. Commissioners, good morning. Always good to see you. I know we're a little off cycle, and part of that is the transition with the board, and part of that is there are a number of other factors here. But as Joanna said, we're here to talk to you about the financial health of our transit work program. Today, that's our main goal, is to just walk through where things are at on the finance side of things, talk to you about some of the details of the projects and how those things are going. We'll work through the status of transit in our region. We'll talk about some other regional things that are going on relative to transit. And as has been mentioned, stop us at any time. We want this to be more of a dialogue. And if there's something where we're sailing too fast, please flag us down. There's a lot of information here that we could go through. And as I say, we're here for you for any detail that, should you desire, we can dive deeper into detail. But we'll try to stay at a relatively high level just to give you the financial overview. So, Mike.
All right. Thanks, Brian. Good morning, Commissioners. As Brian had mentioned, a lot of what we're going to talk about is how things have gone over the past year and what's changed, what risks are out there. Some of these are the same risks that we talked about last year. Some are new. Talk about ultimately the affordability and financing of this program, things that we're assuming to be able to finance the program and to afford it, as well as things that we see coming at us going forward. And ultimately, this conversation is really to help us get an understanding of the county board's endorsement of the Transitway program direction that we have out there, or if you would like to see us go in different directions on things as well. So some of the key things that are out there from a financing side of the world are that when we do this work, as we have always done, we are looking at being conservative, responsible, and regionally consistent with our modeling. And that's both from the financing side of the world. It's also when we think about ridership forecasting and down the road. We want to make sure we're conservative. We don't want to be overly optimistic and then have to do a big U-turn or course correction down the road. On the financing side, we've worked with Baker Tilly on our debt service assumptions. So we definitely aren't doing this all alone. We've got a lot of backup back there to help us make sure that we, again, are being conservative and responsible with the assumptions we're making. A nice piece of this is that, once again, the county can implement the projects it has in its portfolio, being Riverview, Purple Line, Gold Line, over the next 30 years, based on a current understanding of our assumptions and the understanding of the risks that are out there. So that's the kind of nice takeaway out there. We can still implement the program that the board has been pushing to implement since the sales tax was introduced in 2008, and the board had actually worked before that to put this program in place. And some of the good news as well is that with changes to how projects are, the cost for things like Gold Line and ability to pull in some additional federal funds and state funds into projects like Gold Line, we've been able to push bonding out a year beyond what we had planned before, meaning that we thought we were going to have to introduce bonding a year sooner than we do now. So that's a good thing. And the total amount of bonding that we are looking to do has also been reduced by about $50 million. So that's another good thing. So positive things happening there on the financial takeaway side. So some notable changes in 2022 compared to where we were at in 2021. Gold Line's under construction. Last year when we were sitting here back in November ago, it was, we really want Gold Line to be under construction. Now it is under construction. Bridge piers are up, things are going on. It's a real project in the sense that dirt's being turned. So that's really fun to see that happen. Purple Line has moved from we're going to transition to Met Council to, it has been transitioned to Met Council to lead the project. It is in the federal program into the project development side of the world. So that project is going forward. It's also changed in that when we were talking last year, we thought it was going to White Bear Lake, and they have passed their resolution to say, please do not come to White Bear Lake, and we're doing the route modification work on Purple Line to see where its northern endpoint should be. Riverview continues its work in the engineering and pre-environmental phase. It's getting closer to wrapping that phase up. We're thinking this year is when that phase will be wrapped up, so we'll have some good direction on how that modern streetcar project will move forward. The arterial BRT corridors in Ramsey County have advanced further. B line is moving much closer to construction. We've seen G line, which is Rice and Robert Street, and then H line, which is Maryland and Como, start to be planned into the system of the larger metropolitan council. So those are good things that are happening from a transit standpoint in the county as well. And finally, the second train, which we've always talked about as this mythical creation that someday will be here, it now has state funding. It now has federal funding. And we are working with Amtrak to get that implemented in some form this year so that we start to see more service at Union Depot. So that's a big plus for us.
A couple of things I'll say. We're grateful to the board for a lot of the work that you all have done on a number of fronts here. I'll say that this board is responsible for seeing G and H lines advance and receive federal funding. And so those are things that we're going to see start to hit construction in the next four to 5 years. The work that this board has done on the second train to and from Chicago, it's also a big lift. And I know that there was a lot of work that was done behind the scenes to get partners to show up with operating and secure grants. And so those are concrete ways that we're seeing your work come to fruition and helping us achieve those goals. So thank you.
Commissioner Reinhardt and then McGuire.
I just wanted to say that I just want to savor this page because it's not just a change from last year. There's decades of work on each one of those things. And it's just an exciting time. So I just wanted to savor it for a moment.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Commissioner McGuire.
I agree, Commissioner Reinhardt. It's a great slide to savor. Just can you say again the advanced arterial BRT corridors that, I mean, I know I caught Maryland and Como.
Yep, Maryland and Como, which is H line. Yeah. G line is Rice Robert. And then B line, which is Marshall and Selby.
That's
So,
D
B
as
is
in
in
B,
boy.
boy.
as in
Yep.
boy.
And
That's Marshall Selby.
so Commissioner McGuire, if you recall in the TAB discussions, TAB was going to allocate funds to F, G, and H.
Yeah.
The work that you all did to advance G and H into that priority was big. F is what goes up Central Avenue towards Anoka County.
Okay.
So those are three that are receiving federal funds through the regional solicitation to the tune of $25 million each.
Thanks. I
Yeah.
just wanted to make sure I had them all. I appreciate it. Yeah, that's great work.
All right, so as we look at major project assumptions that we've made as part of developing our financing plan for this, we have come with the assumption that all three of our major transit ways are going to be operational by 2032. So Gold Line opening 2025, Purple Line 2026 is the assumption, and then Riverview 2032 is the assumption. So it's again conservative, making sure that we've got the money in place to be able to fund these once they come online. We've also made assumptions related to partner capital and operating contributions. So we're assuming that the county is going to pay for roughly half of the capital of these projects, and the county payment is split between the rail authority and the sales tax that we have, our transportation sales tax. The federal side will pay for about half of the capital, and then we've got the Met Council, which will pay for half of the operating costs once the system is up and running. So those are the assumptions. That's regionally what we've been doing for a long time now, so we've continued to make that assumption going forward. We have also looked at the federal and regional guidelines for how ridership is going, what we should estimate conservatively there for fare box recovery to make sure that plays into our estimates as well.
Commissioner Reinhardt.
I was just going to comment on the Metropolitan Council part of this. And the fact is, that's really state funding that comes through the Metropolitan Council. And we all know that they're facing a financial cliff. And so whatever we can do as metro counties to make sure that the state understands that connection, because we rely on them to have their portion of it. And if the state turns a blind eye to this, then they don't have their portion of it. And so I think it's important to note that that they have that it's been an issue for quite some time. This isn't something that's new, but the state has to step up to the plate on that one.
I absolutely agree, Commissioner, and thank you for the comment. I will say that there are funds that Met Council puts towards operating. The state has a pretty limited role
Oh, is
In
it?
terms of the overall financing, they use a lot of federal dollars for maintenance and ongoing operational costs. But you're right, the state needs to have a stronger role in this and then bear some of that responsibility as we think about a metropolitan transportation network and how we fit into that and the demands that are on this region. We're probably I'll say we're the most mature county in the metro. From a number of respects, and I'll say that, as our system is mature, transit plays an increasing level of importance in how people get around.
Well, and Madam Chair, then I guess I'm going on what I thought I heard from Chair Zelli. So can you, and again, this financial cliff, even though, we are not responsible for that, obviously, because we have our portion that we have to do. Can you give us a little more enlightenment on what that financial cliff is? If it's not the state, then who is it?
So the Met Council has a structural operating deficit for their overall system.
Right.
And there are a number of sources that go into that. A big chunk of it is federal, some of it is state. The state has, to my knowledge, not been increasing with the size of the system, which has been one of the issues. And so the last conversation, that I think the one you're referencing, they referenced something in the neighborhood of a $200 million operating deficit for their service. And to put it in round numbers, I believe their general operating for their service is somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 million. And so that's a pretty substantial proportion in terms of the deficit for their operating.
Well, and I'm bringing it up here primarily because I don't want the public to think that somehow this has to come back to counties, because it really cannot. That's the whole purpose of a regional system, a regional governance structure, is that it is done on a regional level. We have our portion. It's very specific for counties to pay. And whatever the Met Council has to do to fill or to deal with that gap, they have to do. Otherwise, we don't have a metro system.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ortega.
No, I just want to add to that. I bring up a valid point. Even though the budget of the Met Council is more, the state is not as significant a player in that as we think they are, because they're a state agency. I think that's part of the conflict here. The reality is that this is nothing new.
Right.
At the state level. I remember in '95, my very first year, I was the only one from Ramsey County to go and testify because they were going to shut down the bus service on University Avenue. And it was not even a priority on this board. I just did it because I happened to be the chair of the legislative committee, and I was brand new to this. I had no idea what was going on, to be honest with you. It was my first year. But my point to all of this is that transit has always been at the bottom of the list for the state. I don't care what administration, I don't care what party. It's been all the same, and it affects people of color. It affects poor people. It's not a priority, and it needs to be elevated. And the state has to come forth and provide more dollars.
Commissioner McGuire.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Ortega, for those good comments. I had a question just on where the green line fits in here, and I know that's been handed over completely, so it's not really anything we're dealing with. It is a line that goes through our county. And just curious, I was kind of looking ahead to see if you were going to just talk about it. Just put that in perspective, because it's the major LRT line that we have here. And I don't know if you're going to talk about it or just to say that it's totally on Met Council or the state by now, right? Or, yeah. So just talk a little bit about the green.
Commissioner, it's a great question. And if I could, I'll just spend a moment talking about what our various roles are in various things. And so when you think about projects like the ones we're talking about today, like a Gold Line or a Purple Line or a Riverview, our role is to fund the project development, so the engineering and the planning and the community engagement that goes into getting a project built, to partially fund the construction, to work through a federal funding program to get the federal funds to fund the rest of the construction. And then we hand the keys over to Met Council. And Met Council's role then is to operate it with whatever resources they have, both from Farebox and other sources, state and federal. And then our role in operating things like Green Line is to pay for a share of the operating. And so generally speaking, when you think of something like a Green Line, you're looking at how much do they recover from a fare box, and then you look at what are the shares after whatever funds there are from that remain. And so the state pays a share of Green Line operating through Met Council, and then Hennepin and Ramsey pay the other half of what's left after fare box. Does that make sense? And so when Green Line is something that Met Council fully operates, we are a partner in paying for part of the operating, which is the general paradigm for all of the things we're talking about. When it comes to more local service, that is not a role that we play. We do not pay for local service. We have not paid for local service. Met Council builds arterial BRT on their own through state funds that they've received and whatever federal they can cobble together, and they pay for operating through their own operating sources. So A line, B line, G line, H line, those are all Met Transit in terms of how they are funded and how they are operated. We do not pay for a share of those either.
So if I could just
You
follow up,
follow
Madam
up
Chair,
on that.
thanks. So as we know, sometimes when the state is, all the time when the state is short of funds, they cut what they pay for, and we have to pick up the difference. Does that happen in this case too with the Green Line or the Met Council? They're paying, Met Council pays, but if Met Council can't, do we have to pick up the difference? Or are we always, do we just pick up the basic?
So that's where I say, Commissioner and Madam Chair, that's where I say that the state has not increased its share for a long time. You've seen Met Transit do some various things. Most recently, I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, they came up with some legislation that asked for county funds to be directed toward paying for their operating costs. And so that really runs counter to how the whole system works and who does what. And we have those funds to pay for a lot of things, and we pay for our shares of things. And so generally speaking, if Met Transit if the state wasn't showing up with their share, we're fortunate in that in the last couple of years, they've had federal to pick up whatever wasn't covered by their state funds, but they've struggled with their operating.
Thank you.
Commissioner Reinhardt.
Well, and I think it's important to note that this operating deficit that they have is primarily because we're paying for, the counties are paying for half of the operating costs of the transit lines. But that is something that has been historical, so it is really their arterial lines that is the biggest issue for them, I would think. And so it's not that the LRT line, I mean, we're getting the ridership and there's, so it's not that part of their budget that's the major problem anyway. The state still needs to step in. But for the operating costs, and I just don't remember, but I think at one point they just sent us a bill. Do we have any breakdown on that now so that we actually know that we're only paying 50% after the fare box?
Again, we're always here for you in terms of level of detail, Commissioner. There are very detailed invoices that we get on a quarterly
Oh, we
basis
do
from
now.
Met Transit
Okay.
for Green Line, and we will when Gold Line is operational. And so we have a monthly briefing with them where they articulate all of those pieces.
Okay.
So we're pretty clear on what share we're paying, and in this case, the last couple of years have been significantly more complicated because they brought in other sources to try to keep our level stable and to make up whatever they're not getting from their fare box.
Well, that is good news because I know when we first started, that was really complicated, and they were just like, no, just pay the bill. And so I'm glad that we've got that I mean, and it's important for them as well as for us and the state and the feds to have that level of detail. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, and Ryan's going to add.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And Brian, let's see if this can just help on an umbrella level, right? So the principle of funding is all there. The questions around should the funding change has been raised many times over many years in many different ways. I think the way many people here are remembering it most recently is that the full funding grant agreements, which are contracts between the Met Council and Ramsey County, or Metro Transit and Ramsey County, I don't know who signs it, that then codify those shares. What's happening is Metro Transit has come back to counties, us and Hennepin in particular, and said, hey, on these projects, we're not trying to change the share necessarily, but we're saying the amount of money needed to operate the system, to have community ambassadors on the trains, to better clean them, is inflating, and we view that as an extraordinary circumstance, so we need to reevaluate the cost shares, which impacts our end. And so that is and continues to be part of like contractual negotiations, whereas the county would probably say, we agree on a clean transit system, we agree on community ambassadors, but the original agreement wasn't set up for that reason. Those are things where that's a different conversation that needs to occur. I just wanted to give that overarching, I hope that's an okay summary of kind of where a lot of it has sat in recent years.
Thank you.
That's excellent and helpful, and we will touch base on that operating funding agreement here in a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you.
Commissioner Ortega, and then I have others.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to add to that, Mary Jo's question had to do with the green line. So everything after that Brian brought up has to do with our lines, our transit lines, not BRT, not local service. We don't want to go down that rabbit hole because it'll break us. If they can manage it, then and they look at counties in our sales tax regionally, it's not a solution. They're not going to get a solution with that. You're not going to get 7 counties to agree to that. And our dollars were specific to rail and fixed skyways BRT. Fixed skyway BRT. If it doesn't have a fixed skyway, that's just regular bus service.
Okay, thanks.
Right?
That's a good distinction. Yeah.
It's regular bus service, and they need to pay for that. We don't supplant their function and their responsibility to financially.
Thank you. Commissioner Mattis Castillo. Oh, do you have something to add, Brian?
Oh, no,
Thanks. And Rafael, to your point of, their fixed busways, like their stuff. The problem is that, quite frankly, they're not running it well. They keep cutting service, which cuts reliability, which then also plays into the effectiveness of the lines that we're investing in, right? So people don't trust transit because it's not reliable, it's not running where they need it and when they need it. And so then when we invest in lines, it's making our lines set up for failure. And I think that, it's just like when we go out to RFP for service on any project, we're stuck with a partner that isn't coming to the table with the same values and vision that we have. And that continuously is frustrating because we know what our community needs. We're advocating. It's about connecting people, and especially our BIPOC community, our low-income community, our people on fixed income, and people who are making choices based on the environment, and then they don't have the access they need, and that's continuously frustrating. I also am personally concerned, and I get they've got all kinds of financial woes, but I wonder if it's time that we go back and say, this ridership numbers dictating what federal funds we get. We have to challenge that at some point, whether it's us, the Met Council, or jointly, because it's not working to get what we need done. It's like building a bridge after someone crosses the river isn't what we need to do. We need to actually build it so that it's reliable. I'm also concerned that we're relying so heavily on fare box recovery. This is an impediment for people, especially low-income people, to be able to ride the bus. And I know they have all kinds of programs you can apply for reduced fares. But again, we continue to create a full-time job of accessing these services for low-income people as opposed to making transit reliable and maybe not having a cost. right? Maybe the burden should be on the cost of people using roadways. You know, I mean, there's different ways to think about it, but I think we need to challenge the notion and the way that it's being funded, and that we continuously lift up other opportunities, because they haven't moved. You know, in 20 years, they're using the same system, and quite frankly, it's not working.
To this point.
To this point?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say that people need to understand, and I remember this discussion's been going on for a long time as far as the fare box and what happens with that. And actually having legislators say roads are free. So why would we have to pay for transit? Why do we have to do a fare box? Roads are free. But a lot of people were saying that as well, not recognizing, you know, there's a difference when you have to pay a fare to go in there. But roads are really expensive, and we don't have room to expand them.
Right.
And so, but I still remember that there were actually a couple of legislators, I don't think they're there anymore, but this perception that roads are free and transit costs money, and why should we do that, is absolutely ridiculous. So I just, again, putting it out there so that people understand that it's an investment to move people around.
Yeah, it is.
And the investment in transit especially has a larger impact on people of color and people living in poverty.
Commissioner Ortega, you had something to
Thank
this
you,
point
Madam
as well?
Chair. I was just gonna, the issues that Trista brought up, I mean, I think that's why, and as Victoria stated, it's been for 15 years, the issues with the Met Council and the whole governance regionally, that's why it's where it's at today.
Right.
And we need to make sure that we participate in that discussion, because we might have to look forward to, there has to be a better way to do this, because safety and cleanliness of the system is turning away ridership.
Yeah.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And they seem to be stuck. It's the same old formula trying to resolve with the same old problems.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Zhang and then Commissioner Ryan.
2 points. So the first point is, I'm so proud to be here to be able to see this, that they'll be operational in 2032, that I will be here, right? That I'll still be a resident and alive. So I'm super proud of that. So kudos to you all. The second point is, as we are building out the lines, and my understanding is that we share a cost of the operations. It's just that as we have more lines, like where do what other revenue sources are there? And I'm looking ahead, and it looks like there might be the revenue piece. But I guess that's the bigger question, is like, how do we sustain this overall for all these lines and transit lines?
So Commissioner, just let me clarify, are you asking what are the revenue sources we have, or what are other revenue sources we could create?
Just looking ahead, when these are fully operational, I guess. Then
Right.
To me, it just means that the cost will just increase, right? Because we have more lines operating. Where would those revenue sources come from? And will the revenue sources increase?
Yeah, it's a great question. So essentially, at the front end of the program, we're capital heavy. And at the back end of the program, we're operating heavy. And we're able to just switch those costs. So the revenue sources to build it are the same as the revenue sources to operate it, being the sales tax and the rail authority levy. And within this program, we're assuming we paid for Green Line out of sales tax and out of rail levy. We operate Green Line out of sales tax. That's going to happen for all of the projects going forward as well. So we don't need to, the natural growth of both the levy and the sales tax covers us down the road.
And to put a fine point on that, Commissioner, which is an excellent question, I think that's part of the tension, is to say, we've built a program that works from a financial model perspective, and just needed a nod. It works from a financial model perspective, but to the point that Commissioner Ortega was making of, as others say, why don't you pay for X? Why don't you pay for Y? that upsets the balance of the program that we've got, right? And so if you say nominally at some point in the future, we're going to have operating for all these lines and it totals up to 30, 40, 50, 60 million dollars a year, and then someone wants to say, well, why don't the counties pay for 50 million of our operating fund? You can say, time out, we're already paying our share, and you're going to bankrupt us if you ask for things that are not part of the program, right?
Got it. Thank you for that.
Commissioner Moran, you want to say?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is not my arena here, right? But the green line is, because it's in my district. And so my question is in reference to the green line, because I hear, what I'm hearing is low ridership. I hear that the safety and cleanliness maybe is a problem on the green line. And, you know, we have just gone through a pandemic, so there are circumstances and these factors that's causing what we see, right? Because as far as I know, before the pandemic, these wasn't an issue. The ridership was up. So I guess my first question is, what's the impact of what I'm hearing on the green line? You know, is it stable? Can we expect it to be up and running by 2032? And are we seeing low ridership and other issues on other lines?
That's a great question. I'll say some things, and then Mike can course correct. So Green Line is, I'm going to say, around 50% of the ridership that it was pre-COVID, which generally speaking for the metropolitan transit system is about average, maybe a little bit higher. The metropolitan transit system, there are lines where they've essentially eliminated service, and those tend to be more of a commute orientation. As you're well aware, Green Line is not about commute. It's more about point to point along the line, and that's how I would characterize all the work that we're doing is not about getting people from a suburb to a city. It's about connecting to destinations along a line. The impact of the operational challenges they're having, I think they're at the root of some of the community struggles that we're seeing. White Bear Lake is one, Maplewood is another, where they're struggling with rumors that they hear, a perception, and then it's bolstered by some people's experiences. And we had a great conversation about how people experience transit and what conclusions they draw from what's actually going on the service. And different people will come to different conclusions about what they see. If you've been watching the Star Tribune and the letters to the editor, there's been a really robust discussion about this particular issue and how people are perceiving transit and what can and should be done to try to address the issues that are on the line. But it tends to have a reverberating effect on people's willingness to feel like this is a real option for them. And I think to the point of, I think Commissioner Ortega said it, this is affecting people of color. And there are lots of people, and what seems to be happening is if you have a choice to work remotely, if you have a choice to drive, people are tending to do that. And as we talked about, there are places around the country with even the most storied transit systems where there are specific stations or specific lines that are really a demographic that is more likely to be remote work possible, that are going to have lower ridership. And that's part of the tension here, is just the nature of how people are using the system is changing. Some of the Met Transit system has oriented itself well, some of it hasn't. And I think it's presenting some issues in terms of it being a credible, viable, reliable option for people to depend on as we start to build out some of these lines. I don't know, Mike, if you have anything else to offer.
I had two other things I'd like to add from the standpoint of corridors like Green Line, Blue Line, a lot of the local bus service, even routes to like Century College are underserved right now because of the driver shortage.
Yeah.
Like, they're at service levels of 15 minutes, or in Century College's case, every hour, and they could be in Century College, half hour, easily they'd fill those buses. For Green Line and some of the local services, you could fill those things up at 10 minutes or 12-minute frequency. So that is somewhat deflating where the ridership could be. So keep that in mind as Metro Transit's able to hire more bus drivers and rail operators, which they seem to have gotten a good class of, based on their latest outreach in November that they're starting to train those. That'll be good. The other thing that Metro Transit is working on is what they're calling their Network Now plan, which is to take a look at this post-COVID world. What does the system need to look like? So that's going to be the opportunity to look at these corridors, like Brian had said, where a lot of people were commuting in and out and they're able to work from home. How much service do you need to put there versus reallocating those resources into areas where people are using it for not only work, but education, recreation, healthcare, those sorts of trips.
Excellent point.
Yeah, so, so thank you for that clarity around the impact that the Green Line may be having on the bigger system, right, to make those connections. Because I will probably say that in a lot of ways it was created to move people from the suburbs into the city to work and to other places, right? Although we use it for destination, to go to work, to go to a doctor, to, you know, places like that locally. And so we're looking now at impact of a pandemic, because transit, the big vision was to create the Green Line. All the excitement was about people are going to use it. It's a way to get people out of their cars and all the impact that has on the environment to move it. And the pandemic shows up and says, you know, now we're going to work from home, and now, you know, this, you know, people are homeless, and, you know, now we're going to do this different because I want to feel safe. And it's not just about the light rail, it's about the COVID piece too, right? And so, you know, I like the fact that they're now looking at what do transit look like moving into the future, you know, but we're continuing to, you know, we want to do a gold line and a purple line. And we're talking about now between now and 2032. So I think we have to find ways, you know, what do that look like? Because we're not stopping the process of creating more rapid transit, but how do we look at this in a new way as to where we are right now to make sure that, you know, waiting a half an hour and an hour for any transit is not okay. Right, but how do we make sure at some point, for many other reasons, and the many reasons that people have decided not to use transit or the Green Line as a target, right, to get to where they need, you know, but how do we work to create a feel of safetyness, that rapid transit is still the way to get around from here to there. You know, without saying the Green Line is the problem. Because it's not the Green Line, I hear people, I see people, not the Green Line, right? And so how do we do a better job of that piece? So I look forward to what that may look like as we move and continue to want to build and operate transit going into 2032.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Moran, and to everyone, I just wanted to ground on one other piece too. I mean, even as we're going through continued learnings post-COVID and what it looks like, and we're at no means at the end of those conversations, which have impacted a lot of different things, I think it's important to remind ourselves like where we were and where we are in actual number of riders across the system. So, you know, a 3 million person metropolitan area was running 200, I'm looking at Metro Transit's recent data, they came out, 260,000 rides a day was the numbers pre-COVID. I mean, it's not insignificant to moving people around. Even right now, in these conversations that sometimes get framed as nobody is riding transit, I would like to point out there's 150,000, almost 140,000 individuals a day who would disagree with that based on ride data. And I mean, 140,000 people would be the third largest city in the state of Minnesota. And so when we think about ridership, it is important to both recognize the current challenges that have been described here really well, and not to say 140,000 riders a day is a vision or a goal for our system today or tomorrow or in 30 years, but to also realize I find it frequently important just to push back on the narrative when someone says like no one's riding transit. Well, I got 140,000 people that'll raise their hand and say I did, and that provided more space for others to be able to move around in different ways and for efficient movement of people as we think about climate. So I just wanted to add that piece in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ortega.
You know, I just want to add that pre-COVID, the Green Line had the highest ridership of all lines, buses, Blue Line, and it was the one line that had the best subsidies, the best fare box. So that means less to the operating, right? Which then impacted us in terms of our price tag. So it behooves us to pay attention to whoever said the post-COVID, the work the Met Council is supposedly doing, because Trista and I and Victoria, I think, met with Charlie Sully and the Met Council folks and a couple of weeks ago, and I brought up the issue. We got to be careful because while we run all numbers and this county is in good financial shape because we're good stewards, have been for a long time. We don't have the issues that other counties have, and we want to stay that way, so let's keep that in mind. But the other thing is, and it's about equity. We talk about equity at the state level, the governor talks about equity, the legislature, but then they don't fund transit. It is one of the biggest inequities in the state. So you can't have it both ways, and we need to call people on this. And again, I don't care what party they're in. We need to call them out on it and say it's inequitable. You cannot talk about equity. So if the ridership is not high on the Purple Line, the people it serves is critical. They have no other access. There's no other way for them to get around.
That's right.
And that's what we need to focus on, and that's what government's about.
I'll just add before you continue trying to tie things together. I don't think we're in a place where we really know what the full full COVID impacts are, because even us as an organization, we just had workshops on what are our properties and what are we doing with them. A lot of other businesses are doing that as well, and there have been setups and structures that maybe don't work anymore. I know, talking to my previous colleagues, a parking lot that you used to have to wait months to get a space in now is empty every single day. And the property owners are now charging $50 for daily parking because they don't get people signing up for the monthly parking, and folks are only coming in once a day. But at some point, those folks are, they're just carpooling or they're just not going in at all. And those are going to get redeveloped as we continue to see places think, well, maybe we don't need to have these parking minimums. We're going to reduce that. Parking's going to be at a premium. If you're only going down to your office once or twice a week, maybe before you were driving and it made sense, but maybe now it makes sense to be that commuter from the suburbs because it's much cheaper to do busing twice a week versus trying to own a car just for that. Families have gone down to fewer vehicles. These are climate-friendly options that may continue, and I hope they do continue, and we should be thinking about how to incentivize them continuing, and transit is one way to do that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, I will continue now with project risk. So some of the things that are out there on the risk side of the world are just what is our sales tax and rail authority levy stability. So how much are we bringing in actually versus what we forecast to bring in? What happens with bonding and interest rates? So we had, for a period of a solid 10 plus years, historically low interest rates. Now we're back into the era of kind of normal-ish interest rates, not the crazy interest rates of the early 80s, but kind of more reasonable interest rates. As long as we stay in this general area, we're in good shape. If we pop up to interest rates from the early 80s, then it's a different story and we'd have to revisit things going on. But that's ultimately, it's a risk that's out there. And then as we talked about quite a bit, commissioners, and you in particular, just what happens with state funding for operations and capital. And we're always looking for stability there. Federal requirements are also a risk. As we know with Gold Line, we committed our $120 million for our share of that project, and then the feds came back and said, hey, that's great, but what happens if? You guys should really be prepared for that, so how about another $25 million? And we had to commit that as well, and that plays into all these forecasts. So does that continue, or is this a blip, so to speak, on the radar? We talked a lot about ridership trends nationally and regionally, so those are also risks that are out there. Eligibility of projects, Purple Line in particular, as it goes forward. Riverview will also run into this. Just making sure that capital investment grants program funding is out there, and as those programs change, certain things become highlighted more than others. Sometimes it's cost, sometimes it's ridership. As things go forward, things are going to change. So just making sure that we maintain our project's eligibility. Public perception about transit, which was discussed earlier with the safety issue, the cleanliness issue, who's riding it, who's not riding it. And then from a regional standpoint, the desire to invest in rail transit. There's a lot of pushback related to Southwest and the challenges it has had as a corridor that tends to play into the regional desire to continue to invest in rail transit. So that's something that's out there that doesn't necessarily impact a Purple Line or a Gold Line, but it definitely impacts a Riverview as a modern streetcar project. Okay. On the positive side, some more of the opportunities things. Service changes. Yes, there have been a lot of negative service changes. But it also presents this opportunity with the Network Now and being part of that and being at the forefront of advocating with the Met Council about how best to serve our residents and to make sure that we orient the service on frequency and making sure people don't have to wait for an hour between their buses, or even a half hour is pretty much going to take out a lot of people who want to wait for a bus if you have only half-hour service. So focusing on those things. What happens with COVID? Let's look at COVID as an opportunity to say, this gives us a chance to not keep blindly going down the path we've always gone down for the last 20, 30 years. Let's do a sea change. If that's really what we're at, let's use this as an opportunity to do that. Our master operating and funding agreement, this is our wonderful agreement with the Met Council that talks about, excuse me, how we're going to fund things like Green Line. That's good for 5 years. It expired in December. The nice thing about it is it rolls over. So all the terms just continually roll over, but it is an opportunity to start talking about what should we be paying for, what shouldn't we be paying for. As Brian mentioned earlier, the Met Council would like to keep adding things to it. We would like to say, no, we are in for a certain amount of things. That's what we agreed to fund. We're not going to have scope creep on this issue. Capital maintenance costs is one of those scope creep issues that's out there. This is what the governor introduced legislation on this. This is basically the easy way to think of capital maintenance as it's things that you have to maintain. They tend to cost a lot of money and they don't happen very often. So things like replacing a bridge or refurbishing your rail equipment, your rolling stock. Those are kind of once every 20, 30-year things. They cost a lot of money. They are not part of your annual operating costs. So we've looked at that as a Met Council cost. Met Council would like to come to us to pay for a chunk of that. So that's an issue that will ultimately need to be dealt with. It's a risk to us. It's also an opportunity to continue to advance for more state funding for areas like that. And then change of approach on here is really referring to the bus rapid transit pieces. We're going to have Purple Line, we're going to have Gold Line that will also need MOFAs, and those could take a different form than the rail side. They're a little bit easier. There's less of the capital maintenance piece of as much of a concern on those. And then finally, Met Council policy changes on transit ways. The Met Council is absolutely the most risk-averse organization I know. They do not want to have any risk associated with them. So what that means is something that the county may not see as a major risk going forward, something that we're willing to say, you know what, it's part of doing business. You've got to be able to hang out there a little bit and say, this is something that we'll get figured out as you go. The Met Council will say, we're not willing to take it. So you could be in that point where as you're going forward and you're ready to hand over your project to the Met Council, they may say, nope, this risk is too much for us to bear. We need you as a county to address that risk completely before we're willing to take the project. So those are issues that are potentially out there as well.
Mike, going forward, we're going to refer to you as the gambler at that table.
That's right.
I'll take that.
Speaking of money.
Thank you, Brian.
George, I think
Go
that's
for it,
your
George.
slide.
Okay, yeah, Madam Chair, Commissioners, thanks for giving me the opportunity to go over a little bit of the financial implications, talk a little bit more about the technical aspects of that. But yeah, as we do every year, myself and Chris Long Henry, we analyze all the revenue and the cost. So this is a comprehensive analysis that we do. You know, we look at all the revenue sources coming in. We look at all the costs, Green Line, even cost to operate the Union Depot and everything, just to make sure we have enough cash to keep going. And like we've said before, I mean, it's gotten a little bit better over the last couple of years. We do think, however, that being said, that between now and 2033, that we're going to basically utilize all the available funds to just keep doing what we're doing right now. There isn't really a lot of other funds in there to finance new projects or things like that. Once we get to about 2033 or so, at that point in time, we've modeled a debt sale for the rail authority. That'll be paid off. And so at that point, we think that there will be some funds available going forward. And then our model goes all the way to 2055. That will be when the final debt is paid off for all three of these projects. Like people have said, like I say, 2055, the debt service will be paid off. I'll go to the next slide, I guess, here. Yeah.
And just a fine point here, I mean, Commissioner Zhang, you're going to be here to approve that final.
Yeah, you'll be here, that's good.
I'll come in my wheelchair. Yeah, right.
So anyway, moving on. Like I said, I'm waiting to ride that review corridor here. Anyway, as far as revenue, again, it's been performing a little bit better than projections. And when you do this modeling, these capital project modeling, I mean, even just a few million more per year makes a big difference, especially if we get the money earlier as well, too. So just since, like I say, a couple years ago, we were really close to having to say to the board that we're going to probably need a little bit of extra money, but we have, we're okay now. But like I say, we're not too far away from being back to that if inflation takes its toll. But nonetheless, a pleasant surprise has been the sales tax receipts. They've been running about $3 million more than we projected, 2 years ago or so. So that's helped finance these projects. Right now, we've worked with Baker Tilly. They do have forecasted a fairly significant rise in interest rates, but it hasn't gotten to the point yet where it's made it expressly difficult to finance. Purple Line has decreased a little bit in cost. There's still a lot of balls in the air as far as that goes. So that's helped as well too. So that has helped the financial situation. Going forward, we'll definitely be partnering with Central Finance. We'll be engaging Baker Tilly. I think at this point, our bonding needs are going to probably hit about 2025. So we'll want to run some more sophisticated financing models and things to help us plan the exact amount of debt sales and issues and things. We'll be coming back to the board too as well to, I think as far as that goes, and to declare some tax exempt, do some tax exempt declarations as well too. And so anyway, nonetheless, we are doing all right now. We're managing to finance this, but like I say, everyone's talked about, we do have to watch inflation. We have to watch the interest rates. We do got to watch these, two dedicated revenue sources that we have, because that makes a huge difference in financing these projects.
So Madam Chair, if I could, I'll just say, I mean, one, we're fortunate. We've got a great finance team that's really got a lot of the detail here. They're watching it closely, and we've got we're saying we're going to get a more sophisticated model, but it's not like we've got a solar powered calculator. We're just the spreadsheet. And if you guys, again, we're here for your detail. If you're ever so interested, George and company can show you a very involved spreadsheet that can walk you through all of the assumptions. It's fairly involved, but I'll say, for one, our finance folks have done a lot of work to make sure that this works. For another, I'll say that our team has done a really great job of going after federal funds through the Met Council process, and that's a place where a couple of you have really been helpful in finding other federal funds that supplement that work that end up bringing everybody's costs down, which has been really helpful. But I think the point I take away from this is that as we come to you with individual milestones where the board approves certain things, you can have a high degree of confidence that we can afford it. We're not coming to you with some risky thing. We're coming to you with the knowledge that we can pay for it.
Commissioner Manis-Castillo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. George, will you remind us how much sales tax we get and what the sales tax percentage is right now?
Yeah, we have, the board, I believe, several years ago approved a half-cent sales tax for transit. So right now, in 2023, you project we'll bring in about 46 million or so. And like we've talked before, we've been pretty conservative in our forecast going forward. We do have it going up to about 50 million in 2031, then we've held it, constant at that point. Obviously, it varies back and forth between if there's recessions or not.
And that's a half cent on anything sold in Ramsey County?
Yeah, it follows the same sales tax law. So if something's exempt now, like for example, if labor is exempt, well then that's exempt too. It kind of mirrors the state law on sales tax. But anything that's,
So I think this is a good point to maybe bring it up because I think it's a concern about our future projections and what we're currently have a half-cent sales tax for transit. That's how we're funding it. As you know, there has been some proposals at the city of St. Paul is proposing another half-cent sales tax to fund their roads and parks. Potentially, also there is a sales tax proposal. Is it a 1 cent?
City was a full cent.
Oh, I'm sorry, 1 cent at the city and then a half-cent regional,
full cent
and
for the
another
region.
full cent in the region. So, and that's coming from the governor's office, the Met Council, proposing a regional-wide sales tax. So if they all passed, we'd be at 2.5 cents, and only the half cent would come back to us. But the concern could be is if we start adding up, does that hurt us? Is it, does that look like? How are we taxing our residents? How are we taxing our citizens? And we haven't had a chance to have that conversation as a full board. I've heard from some of you individually, but I think this might be a place that we could have this conversation about, in the past, there's been a dedicated, any sales tax was going to transit. It was a basic principle. That's something that was set in the past. I think it's an opportunity to have that discussion and to see where we sit on those other sales tax proposals. The regional one, of course, is the Met Council. We've already talked earlier in this presentation about some of the issues, the Met Council and how those funding sources would go out. As we know, they have a huge deficit in other areas, not necessarily to fund more things in the East Metro, but they have deficits on Southwest Light Rail that they need to fill, and then also the city's proposed sales tax. So I just wanted to pose that question so that folks can have an understanding. Maybe, Madam Chair, we can start with our Regional Rail Authority Chair.
Go ahead, Commissioner Ortega.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think we need to have a board discussion on these issues. This regional sales tax is 1 cent for transit, correct?
As far as I know. I don't know that I've seen anything official, but what I've heard discussed is 1 cent for transit.
Well, that's what I've heard too.
Yep.
My issue with that is I would like to know exactly, we need to know the details of that tax before we even think of supporting it. Because talking about equity, there's an inequity between the East Metro and the West Metro in terms of transit dollars. When you look at what happens in the West Metro, where they've gotten in the last couple of years $500 million from the states plus, I'm being conservative, and we don't even, we're not in the ballgame here. So if they're collecting money from the East Metro, is it going to West Metro projects? I'd like to know more about that. The other thing is we need to get from staff the impact it has on our residents. Because, we were at the legislature yesterday and we talk about the continuum of care, we talk about the homelessness and so forth. And at the same time, we might be adding more people to the homeless list. I know I hear from my constituents in certain parts of my district where, and I'm sure everybody has, where they're on fixed income. They just cannot pay the property tax. There's nowhere to get it from. We got to balance all of these issues before we even though I'm a big transit guy and I know the big transit organization, I'm not gonna jump to okaying something where there isn't a benefit to the residents of Ramsey County.
Yeah, thank you.
Mike Wyatt?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just, I don't want to lose this thought, but I was walking in today and our county manager actually takes the bus to work, which I was like impressed. Good job. Speaking of transit, I think
One
that's
rider
great.
today.
Yeah, one rider. I'm really impressed. That's great. Can you remind us, now we're on the revenue side, you were talking about sales tax receipts. But remind us what the Regional Rail Authority levy is. I mean, and what is that? Is that regional, so everybody, can you just talk about that a little bit?
So the rail authority levy is levied for Ramsey County only.
Yeah.
And I want to say this year it was between 29 and 30 million. I want to say it maxed out just under 30 million, but I don't remember the exact number, but that gets you in the ballpark.
Okay.
So that's just for Ramsey County residents.
And we, as a regional rail authority chaired by chaired by Commissioner Ortega, we pass that levy authority every year, right? I mean, we do that with our budgeting process.
Madam Chair, Commissioner McGuire.
Yeah.
Think of it, it's the same as the HRA levy.
Yeah.
It's a statutory option to local governments and counties. The difference being you were here when the HRA levy passed, so it probably stands out a little more, and the regional rail levy predates you and I both on this one, so it's been there for a while. There's a statutory maximum based on assessed values of what can be collected, and the county has followed that formula to maximize the revenue coming in for the reasons of this presentation, so we have enough money to fund the system. So it's a line item in your budget outside of the general property tax. You'll see it as we go through approvals, and then you actually have to vote on it separately compared to the general levy. That's why we take multiple votes at the end of the year.
I appreciate that reminder. Thank you for that. I just couldn't remember how that got determined in the first place. I know it's on our properties tax statement, so we just follow the rules, the guidelines set forward by the initial authority. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Go ahead.
So I just want to ditto Commissioner Ortega around what we're doing with the sales tax versus West Metro versus East Metro. As a state legislator, I was always believing that St. Paul and Ramsey County was left out this process. And it wasn't fair, it wasn't equitable. And so we really need to know what we are doing with the dollars that we have. If we're going to invest, is it coming back to us? So I look forward to having that informational piece.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Castillo, to your broader question too. I think this would summarize too some of what we've seen on the staff side. I mean, there's no dispute that Metro Transit needs additional revenue to run a world-class, even region-leading or nation-leading, they're all on a continuum, we can get there, transit system, right? And there's big visions for the future that has been led by our regional rail work and the county board around what the East Metro would look like, and that all requires Metro Transit to have revenue somehow. The piece around equity is really important, both in terms of having a world-class system, as Commissioner Ortega mentioned earlier. I just also want to say from like how you choose to raise that revenue matters. Property taxes are the most regressive. You all know it, you hear it all the time, we talk about it all the time. Sales taxes fit somewhere in the middle. While we exempt certain categories, sales taxes are still more regressive, and lower income households pay a higher share of their income into sales taxes than do higher income households. It's just a fact. Income taxes are, of the three, the most equitable in terms of progressivity in the tax base, particularly in the state of Minnesota. And so I'm not trying to weigh in on your specific question. I just want to add, I have not heard the conversation more broadly than here talking about that. And I think at some level before I don't think there's a dispute from anyone that the system needs money to function well, just like a road or anything else. But how you choose to raise that revenue is vitally important in how it impacts both the people riding it and the overall community as a whole. And I'll just end with the thing that we all say all the time, but I'll get the free space on the bingo card today. We are the only county in the region in which the median household income is less than the median cost of living. And so I think we have to center all of that in the conversation as we go ahead.
Commissioner Mattis-Castillo, and then, or Brian, did you have something to that specifically?
If we're going to stay in the same thread, I can wade.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have been contacted from other entities to see how our board weighs in, which is why I wanted to bring it up, and we have not had a conversation, and, we're following all the laws, so that's why I bring it up here. So I'll just share some of the arguments on both sides, and I'm not trying to sway anyone, I just want to hear your thoughts, is that, there's an opportunity in particular for the St. Paul sales taxes. We do have visitors, and to recoup some of the money from visitors who come and purchase and buy and participate in events here. So it was this thought of there's some opportunity to capture outside money. I will just add, this is my narrative, I still think that we have to have a concern for the people who currently live here for all the reasons everyone just mentioned. So for adding additional costs to the things that they need to purchase daily, it does play a toll, even at 1 cent. The region-wide one, the arguments are just, well, the Met Council needs money, this is a collective effort. And again, I share all the concerns I heard about, like, what exactly is it gonna go to? What is that formula? How do we have equity in the region? And so I have shared with entities who've reached out to us that our board does not have a position on this at this time because we haven't had the chance to have this conversation. It's not currently in our legislative agenda. And so that, we haven't signed on to any bill one way or the other, but just wanted to kind of fill out context so if others want to weigh in on thoughts around those two things.
Madam Chair, well, I think your suggestion to have a workshop just dedicated to that and how it impacts our residents, especially our folks that are on fixed income, because everybody's raising their costs, right?
Right.
I mean, everybody is. And it makes it, I feel pain when I have to deal with a constituent, and even though we get into the nitty-gritty and there's no way, there are people that have no options. And we keep raising. We should be doing this with a full understanding of the impacts. That's
excellent.
My point.
Thank you.
And I appreciate that, and I agree, Madam Chair. We've all had separate conversations, not together, about this issue, and I would love an opportunity to really, have some more information. How does this really affect us, and how can we, how do we weigh in on this as a board? Because I haven't been able to figure out where I might stand on it for all the reasons everyone's talking about. And I'll just say here that, what we've all been saying, we can't tax our people anymore. We'll tax them out of their houses with the property tax. And I'm just hoping that at some point, AMC, NACO, any of us that are working on these, we find a way that counties can levy on the income tax. There is an organization that's working on that. I just think we need to start talking about it more, that we have to have another revenue source other than property tax or sales tax. It's ultimately, it's so unfair that that's all that we get to do, and we have too many needs to only have that as our resource. So I know it's always hard to talk to the legislators and congressional delegation about that, but I do think we need to be able to access income tax versus property tax.
Thanks.
I'll just say, I just want to push back on sometimes when we hear we've got a big budget surplus at the state that, well, we're taxing people too much. No, we can actually fund the stuff on the least regressive tax source without raising taxes if we have all this extra money, because the response is whenever we're asking for funding for things that need funding, like Med Council and transit and early childhood ed and health care and our direct care workers, well, we can't raise taxes. We don't need to, the money's there. We just need to actually pay for the things that we already know need money with our option that is least regressive to folks around us.
Right. Great, thanks. I will stop hijacking your meeting.
Good try. Madam Chair, I appreciate it. So
Snuck it in.
I appreciate the thought on a workshop, and we'd be happy to do that, should that be something that's helpful and we can figure out timing and
Yeah, Madam Chair, Brian, I was just talking to the CFO about it. We're going to work on a framing of that. We're going to talk to St. Paul, who may have done some modeling on their particular tax. We're going to spitball around on how to maybe bring that back. So you don't need to, you just keep going here and we'll take care of that one.
Yeah, I want to put just two other thoughts out there. That one, I think part of what we could think about is that I'm not clear that straight line is what you could expect from a sales tax increase. Like, would we see another $43 million coming to Ramsey County on another half cent? I don't know. I don't think so, but I'm not an economist. The other thing I'll say is, right,
Well,
it feels like,
Madam Chair, if I could also, I mean, the bottom line is the legislature, when they were so kind as to give us the authority to put the sales tax on, even then, I mean, they had the option of doing it through a less regressive tax, meaning the income tax. So giving us that permission was great. I mean, we're grateful for it. Don't get me wrong, because we've got money to pay for transit. But it really should have been on the state then.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things that it's, no matter what we do, if the state isn't willing to step up and do the right thing as far as paying for the things that they are, especially for counties, the mandates on us. Right. It's not like we go, gee, I think we'll do that program. We try to make the most cost-effective use of the funds that we have to meet the mandates. And so I just didn't want that to get lost in this, that, giving the right to add a sales tax is really something that if the state just, funded the things that they're supposed to fund. Right? So,
just to finish the thought, I think there, as the number increases, we're probably likely to see exemptions. And I'll say working through the data center exemption was weird and a bit of a liability. And so that's just something to think about as we see other proposals float out there. And then lastly, I'll say, the balance of responsibility along the lines where Commissioner Reinhardt said, I can speak to transportation funding and say the balance of funding is shifting to greater Minnesota. There isn't an emphasis on transportation investment from a statewide level at a metro area focus. And so if you're going to say the balance of funding is shifting to roads in greater Minnesota, I'm on board. They have needs, they have access needs, but we have the same needs. It just so happens that access equals transit rather than access equals increased highways. But if the state is going to do that for greater Minnesota, they should be willing to invest more in the metro area for transportation. And I never hear someone say, gee whiz, that road in Coochin County sure looks like there's nobody on it very much. And I don't mean to pick on Coochin County, it's just a fun word to say. But, but there are lots of roads where there are literally almost no one is on them throughout the day, but no one ever thinks to themselves, gee whiz, I wonder why that's not very well used. But yet we have that same argument about transit. And I'm saying, if we're going to shift those funds, let's have a real conversation about how we have the same needs that just look a little different in terms of how you deliver it.
Well, and I'll just add, because I'm the chair, and I call on myself. We know that there are so many studies out there talking about how increasing transit access results in increased economic opportunity, economic growth, right? It brings money back. That money comes back to the whole fund. When people are able to access better jobs because they have better transit, they pay more in income taxes, which means we have more money that can then fix that road in Coochin County.
Isn't that a fun word?
It is. I had a coworker who would abbreviate in an inappropriate way, so you have to say the whole thing.
Moving right along.
All right, and my favorite county to say from where I grew up is Watonwan. So I like the southern Minnesota counties. Just saying, Brian.
Good call.
So just some other areas that Ramsey County has some strategic roles in. As we talked about, ABRT, we're really advocacy planning partner, not the primary funder of any of that. We're a lead on the Blue Line Riverview Connection Study. That is the work going on. That's work from when Riverview selected the modern streetcar as its locally preferred alternative to figure out how best to connect Riverview as well as Blue Line through the Highland Park our Highland neighborhood of St. Paul. We also are an advocate planning partner for the second train to and from Chicago. Same for freight connections as we work with our freight partners, knowing that those passenger trains go on their network. And then when it comes to downtown St. Paul vision and really visions for anywhere in the county, we're an advocate and we're a planning partner. The more our local communities can have solid visions of what they want to become, the easier it is for us to see how our vision can play into that, and so we can be there together to make those visions become a reality sooner. And then finally, on the transportation initiative side, kind of how are we working outside of just this transit piece and working with the larger parts of the county? And we've got our All Abilities 2050 plan, which is really the first public works style plan for what to do with the county from a transportation standpoint going forward. So that looks out to 2050. It's the long range investment, looks at strategically investing the limited financial resources we have, wants to make sure that we're consistent with our performance measures and targets. And it really looks at that all abilities network as well to say it's pedestrians, it's bikes, it's transit, it's automobiles. How do we make the best use of moving all the modes with the limited resources we have? And then on the community and economic development side, this is something we talked a little bit about last year of how we're going to start integrating with them. We've made some, I think, significant progress there. The Critical Corridors program that community and economic development has, we at Public Works reviewed a number of those applications, talked about how they worked with things we were doing to see if we could maximize those better as part of CED scoring them and then ultimately awarding those grants. We're looking at market analysis and development opportunities. Where can we see where the market wants to go and how can we impact that with our projects to add that accessibility, transportation planning and corridor development, and things like linking transportation and development investments. And one thing I just want to share from my trip down to Railvolution in Miami is there's a lot of talk about passenger rail and how it's all funded by the federal government here or local bodies. And many of you may know that there's a couple places in the country that are not funded by the feds or by the locals. It's Brightline, and that is Miami, ultimately to Orlando, and then Palmdale, California to Las Vegas. They're also doing that as a train corridor. And they basically have said, you know what, transportation and land use are not separate things. We're going to use the transportation investment to make us money on the land use and development side. So they're using the ability to bring people to the properties they own and have developed to drive the value of those properties, and then they'll sell off the transportation aspect. And what I mean by that is, specifically to Brightline, is the Florida East Coast Railway owned that line. It built Brightline through a subsidiary of itself. It has now sold off those tracks for in between $500 and $600 million. But it kept train slots, so it can still run its passenger trains. It's making its money on all the station area development for the land it controlled. So it's just an interesting way to say, we don't have to be separate. Let's look at this together to how we can make a bigger benefit on things going forward instead of looking at things in just one silo or the other.
I just have to comment on the Brightline because I was also there and I've taken that Brightline a couple times, and I've taken it with people that really don't like transit and they love that line. I mean, it is a clean, fast, safe. It is, I mean, it was privately funded, right? I mean, it's an amazing line, but it had people that said, I never thought I would ever want to take transit, and here I am. Really, if we had this, I'd take that, So you know that you can make transit be something that people will take. So we just have to invest in it.
Right, thank you. And that puts us to the question and discussion slide, if we have any more left.
Now do we get to discuss? All right.
So if I could.
Yeah,
I'll
go
just
for
say
it.
that last piece about the transportation plan, like what you have in front of you is an articulated vision for transit for the county. You have a plan that pays for it. And I think all of you have gotten an email from one of our folks in Public Works about the upcoming transportation plan. So I think that that's going to help us maybe thread some of these things together that we've talked about, whether it's connecting with CED, about how we think about economic development and transit corridors, or whether it's some of the things that we see in other cities and the things that we want to see develop in our county system. It's going to be those kinds of things that we can talk about and how we can potentially get there. So,
Commissioner McGuire?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And because I've heard about, of course, we all heard about the All Abilities Transportation Plan, and it factors into the active living, because, as we try to get routes to our transit lines, that includes biking and walking paths and things, and so I just want to add that it's all part of this plan, is that we got to get to transit, and so that includes all of these other abilities networks, all abilities networks. So just good job on making sure that we have biking and walking paths to get to these transit lines.
Madam Chair, just a couple of wrap-up points on top. I appreciate the work here of everybody and continuing to bring this forward on an annual basis so you can see where our financial projections lie. Coming out of COVID, we didn't quite know what we would see this year and last year, and I think it's actually a spot where you should have a lot of comfort, and anyone broader than this, that this is a revenue stream that's been managed well. Our project planning still is managed well. In all the craziness of the last few years, this is something where we still see that we have right-sized what we can do with what we're hoping to do. On a broader level, I simply do not know how Ramsey County or the region achieves any of its climate goals or development goals without a robust transit network. Full stop. And anyone who wants to have that discussion, we should have it, and we can have that anytime. And so we need the system to be successful, and in the conversations around how to fund it and what it looks like, and even in our frustrations, it's rooted in a fundamental belief from this table and beyond that it is at the core of our success. Mike, I love where you almost ended, because the conversation, not specific about how Brightline was done, but one of our continued pushes for advocacy is greater alignment at the Metropolitan Planning Agency that implements housing, transportation, and land use. And wastewater, but I was leaving that out. Okay, Brian wants and wastewater. Putting wastewater to the side and looking at the other three, because I don't know how to integrate transit and wastewater, Brian. There just is such an opportunity where to have a robust planning agency fulfill its vision of what it was created for, there is more room on that front. And on the financing side, you heard some ideas of where that could then generate additional land use revenue, which then allows us to fund more housing or more transit in a self-propagating positive loop. I wanted to point those two things out. We as a staff will continue to push as well in alignment with the county board's vision, mission, and goals. And I want to lift up our team, because it has not been a couple easy years with transit. Everyone can read about Southwest all the time. Southwest carries some unique development challenges and topography challenges that drive it. It's not because transit is not a part of our regional vision. And it's led to cost things, and I think it's a really tough time right now for transit development because of that. And through the work of the regional rail and through the work of our team, they've really stayed the course. And I just wanted to acknowledge that as we go forward. Because we got to help carry this one forward in the years ahead.
Commissioner Moran.
I always feel like, Ryan, you should go last, because you just wrap everything up and, do such a great job at that. I want to thank the presenters today for your presentation. It has been very informational. I've learned a lot from this presentation. But I do I do look forward to the presentation around what the dollars have been spent on, who benefits from it. Because with all the, I'm gonna say, negative conversation around the green line, and with the cleanliness and being unsafe and things like that, it is a line that was in many ways brought through a community that was doing okay, who use it really for their livelihoods. And often that train doesn't stop at those destinations, right? But we have to make it work now. And so coming out of the pandemic, we're still at 140,000 ridership. That's pretty huge to me, but maybe not. So I would like to know what is happening with the other rail lines. What is those riderships like? If the Green Line was bringing in previously to the pandemic over 200,000 ridership, maybe we was carrying some of those other lines, where they have maybe lower riderships. No. And so I really would like to see those numbers and what that looks like. And because it is, some would say that transit is the way of the future. So we need to make this successful. We need the green line and all the other lines, from the gold line to the purple line to a Riverview line, to be successful. And so the more information we can get, I think the better it would be helpful for us as commissioners in the county board.
Madam Chair,
Thank
Commissioner Moran, just in case I may have misspoke earlier, so I want to clarify one point. I gave you the overall system ridership numbers.
Oh, okay.
But specific to the Green Line pre-COVID, I'm going to play a little fast with the number, but it was the top performing piece line to the system at about 50,000 or 40,000 riders, 40,000 riders per day. So of your entire system, 1 in every 6 riders rode the Green Line. And then the Blue Line was another 30,000 riders a day. And so the 2 rail lines that were massive, major projects, took a long time, covered 70,000 of that 250,000 plus riders within it, to give you a sense of scope. And so they are, the Green Line is the top performing part of the system. The system rises and falls based on that ridership, and your points are well taken.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. I think this was a great discussion, and I want to repeat Commissioner Reinhardt's point that despite what you may have heard, roads aren't free. And even when we're, even that road in Coochin County is not free, and that there's got to be a way to pay for it. And when we see transit consistently undervalued and overlooked, when we talk about policy and funding, it's because we've compartmentalized everything, and we see transit as that is for people of color to ride, but I have the choice to drive a car. And we forget that there is connection between transit, between jobs and businesses and critical corridors, between housing, between land use, and that when we invest in ways to get around, it helps everybody, even people who aren't riding it, because we may even be talking about the 40,000 cars that weren't on University Avenue because people were riding the Green Line. So investing in transit helps us all, whether you ride it or not. And the more we invest in it, the more people who ride it, the fewer cars we have on the road, and the cheaper, though not free, those roads become. So looking forward to hearing more and how we continue to elevate the need for transit investment and ask for it to be funded in the least regressive ways. And with that, we are adjourned.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, so 12 o'clock down in our board office.
To you about carbon monoxide